Stop telling celebrities about the Omegaverse. I am literally begging you. As the internet and fandom is evolving and marketing is trying to keep up with that, we're starting to see a very uncomfortable crossover between a fandom space, which used to be kept completely separate from celebrities, and brands that are looking for viral moments utilizing fandom to make celebrities and the rest of us pretty uncomfortable. And now we're starting to cross over from just celebrities that are marketing fictional television shows into brands marketing themselves with their athletes. Most recently, and the reason I wanted to make this video talking about this today, we saw Ferrari's sponsor Peroni decide to make a branded video with two Formula One drivers, Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, who are teammates and probably two of the most famous guys that are on this grid, asked to make a video where they read titles of fanfiction about themselves to each other, and then are asked to guess the plot of those fanfictions.
So, a fan wrote a story about you, and the title of the story is National Anthem Agent 44.
This is not the first time we're seeing celebrities confronted with fanfiction in a really awkward space that is absolutely for marketing. Most recently, we've been seeing BuzzFeed obsessed with telling celebrities about the Omegaverse and showing it to them for the very first time. I think two of the most high-profile versions of this that we've seen recently were Storrie and Hudson Williams of Heated Rivalry being told about the Omegaverse.
I love watching Heated Rivalry because it's the closest I'll ever get to watching an alpha and omega go at it. What is omega?
It's a little bottom boy.
No, that's a beta.
So this thing called the Omegaverse.
Yep.
The alpha's the top, the omega's the bottom. It's for dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
They be going at it, they be going into heat.
Damn.
Where, of course, they did get a number of very viral clips that I'm sure you've seen if you watch Heated Rivalry, which most likely if you watch this channel, you did watch Heated Rivalry, where they're told about the werewolf dynamic aspect of the Omegaverse, who's the alpha, who's the omega, how pheromones work, and are confronted with this idea of the fact that people are writing Omegaverse fanfiction about their characters. Additionally, we saw the same thing with the interview with the vampire actors who were told about the Omegaverse and asked about it on camera, and also asked to read tweets about it with their own characters as well.
Omega is like the bottom and the submissive one.
Oh.
The top, and then the beta is kind of the neutral.
Right.
Omegas can get pregnant regardless of what gender.
Right. Interesting. That's progressive.
And combined with these two recent press tours, as well as this branded video for Peroni and Ferrari with Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, we are starting to see a very uncomfortable trend of utilizing a fan space for shock value marketing that makes everyone uncomfortable, and is morally a really big gray area. But this is not something that just came out of the blue. In my opinion, the way that the internet has shifted, fan spaces have shifted, and the way that marketing has worked for a long time has been building to this exact sort of line crossing. So today, in a very special episode of Marissa Explains It All, we are going to talk about fanfiction, fandom, and how those spaces are starting to be utilized by marketing, and how exactly we got to embarrassing celebrities for fun. And now, if you're new to the world of fan spaces and fanfiction because you usually watch me for sports, don't worry, we can explain this the exact same way I break down the sports basics. The actual term fanfiction and the wide practice of it started with a fandom that started most things that you are familiar with, which was in the 1960s with the Star Trek fandom. Back then, before sites like Archive of Our Own, or if you're a little bit older and are aware of the history of the internet, fanfiction.net or LiveJournal, fanfiction for the Star Trek fanbase was actually distributed in hard copy zines. The very first one was in 1967, a zine called Spockanalia. And this zine that was published was filled with stories that were written by actual fans of the show that took characters from the show that was airing and put them in different situations than we actually saw in the television show. Now, while it is a common misconception that every piece of fanfiction is a romantic fanfiction and explicit, that is not the case with all fanfiction. Actually, there's a huge amount of fanfiction that involves characters in a completely platonic way, just having an adventure inside the world of that television show or book, or even taking those characters outside of a world like Star Trek and putting them in an alternate universe. That could be something as simple as taking Spock and Kirk and taking them to a different world where they are in a coffee shop. Fanfiction in its most basic term is just stories with characters that are established in a piece of media, written by people who are not associated with that piece of media, using those characters to tell a different story that does not happen in that TV show. However, of course, one of the most famous ships or relationships that you're hoping to see happen that doesn't actually happen on TV, in Star Trek and arguably in fandom as a whole, is of course Spock and Kirk.
Spock. I have been, and always shall be, your friend.
This is what we call slash fanfiction, which is two characters being in a romantic relationship, whether they are actually in that romantic relationship on screen or not. Now, Spock and Alia was full of fanfiction that was about Spock and Kirk kissing on the mouth, and that's something that, you know, that people were entitled to do with their free time. As these fan-made zines were distributed, we started to see the birth of modern-day fanfiction really expand. And of course, once the internet comes along, we see way more of it because it's way easier to distribute and reach other people in the world with the World Wide Web. You start to see fanfiction in the early days of the internet being made available on things like message boards or chat rooms. And then of course, as the internet starts to expand, we start to see websites that were made for things like blogging, like LiveJournal or Tumblr, utilized to distribute fanfiction and sort of build that space where fans are able to read these stories, share these stories, and comment on them. And then of course, we have another era where we start to see dedicated websites built for fanfiction, things like fanfiction.net and eventually Archive of Our Own, which is sort of the gold standard these days. And while I do want to say that this is a very, very brief summary of the idea of modern day fanfiction, fanfiction as a concept has existed for a very long time. Prior to the concept of copyright and legal aspects of owning characters and writing, we have things that we would call adaptations. And we still use that term today for things that are outside of the bounds of copyright or using copyrighted material. But if you look at it on its face, some of the greatest literary minds that we regard were writing fanfiction in practice. Shakespeare, for example, had some of his most famous plays considered fanfiction of other stories that had been told before or plays that had been written before. Of course, he added his own spin to them. He made different stories. He made them larger. He made his own characters and their own traits in this. But objectively, Shakespeare, a lot of his plays were literally fanfiction. My favorite fun fact about fanfiction and like published literature is actually that the very first vampire story published in English was absolutely fanfiction. Like, no question about it. Not an adaptation, not this great literary work. Fully fanfiction. In 1819, John Polidori actually published a story called The Vampire. Now, John Polidori was actually the medical doctor to another very famous writer, Lord Byron. And a couple of years before John actually publishes The Vampire, Lord Byron enters a scary story writing contest with two other authors you may have heard of, Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley. Byron's story focuses on this character called Lord Ruthven. He's this aristocratic, kind of suave character who ultimately is a vampire. And after he writes this story for this sort of contest with his friends, Polidori reads it and is like constantly like, dude, when are you gonna finish it? When are you gonna write the rest of this story? You have to get the rest of it done. I am obsessed with this character. Please give me more. And Lord Byron's like, I don't know, man. Like, I don't really feel like writing more. So John Polidori goes, you know what? Fine, I'll do it myself.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
And he writes The Vampire, which ultimately he publishes. And if that's not fanfiction, that is fanfiction. That's how fanfiction works. A person reads something and becomes so obsessed with it that they are desperate for more and they write their own. Now, obviously, once we bring in the world of copyright, things become very different because those characters and those stories are protected by the ownership and copyright laws, which means that I can't just watch a show and say, I love those characters so much, I want to write another story about them and publish a book that is exactly those same characters and just my own story about it. That would be very illegal, which is how we get into this sort of space of fanfiction. Fanfiction is this fandom practice of writing stories with characters that are copyrighted, using those characters, putting them in your own situations, sometimes making them kiss, and sharing those online with your friends and your community with the express intent of not making money. Fanfiction only works when you are not doing it for profit. You cannot monetize on copyrighted characters, and that is a very important thing that we are going to talk about throughout this video. So I think we've well established that the concept of fanfiction is an urge that has been felt since the 1800s, if not before. And as we have brought in protections for creatives like copyright, it becomes something that, yes, you can practice, it's not illegal, but it becomes illegal when you try to make money off of it. Now, when I first talked about this Ferrari and Peroni branded video where they were asked to read fanfiction titles to each other, one of the most common complaints and reactions I saw is that people felt that this was the very first time, or it's becoming a new trend, that fandom and fanfiction are crossing over into mainstream media. And I would actually say that this is not the case. And I'm not just talking about this historical concept of fandom and fanfiction prior to copyright. There's actually been fanfiction writers in history that have gone from writing fanfiction to actually writing in the canon of that show. Star Trek, as always, is going to be one of our biggest examples of this. As fanzines for Star Trek were being published throughout the 1960s and 1970s, we were also seeing official licensed novels in the Star Trek franchise being published for the Star Trek canon. And again, if you're normally a sports person and you're watching a fandom video for the first time, I know I just threw a lot of terms at you. Canon is what we use to refer to as the official kind of story that's happening on screen, approved by the writers. Another term you'll hear thrown around is fanon, which is the fan version of canon. So you'll see a lot of topics that are frequently the same over and over again in various fanfiction stories from different authors. That becomes sort of fanon, even though it's never been actually said on screen. So what we were seeing in the 1970s and 60s were not only just these fanzines that were being published that were definitely not what was happening on screen, aka Spock and Kirk actually being in a relationship together. We were also seeing Star Trek themselves publish novels that they knew people would read because these fanzines were so popular. And one of the first major commercial crossovers between the fanfiction world and the actual TV world was the fact that some of these authors from these fanzines actually got hired to write official Star Trek novels. Jean Laura is a great example of this. She was an author who was writing fanzines and publishing her own zine that ultimately ended up publishing a number of official Star Trek novels. So I would actually argue that even before the internet, from the beginning of this concept of fanzines, of fan fiction, this modern day version of fan fiction that really starts with the Star Trek franchise, there has been a commercial crossover of an official kind of canon and the producers of that show utilizing the fan space and these fan stories to not only find talent, but also to build their own sort of extended universe. Star Trek novels are a thing that are even still happening today. And of course, Star Trek is always going to be one of the biggest sort of golden versions of this because this fandom has been around for so long and is so intensely active, and that the world of Star Trek and the canon, so to speak, of Star Trek continues to expand with new television shows, new movies, new versions of it constantly. But at this point, I would call that relationship a decently kind of respectful one, where we were seeing a world where kind of officially licensed fanfiction was becoming a real thing. But all of this is of course happening before the rise of the internet, and also we're seeing a lot of this really be focused on the characters of the show and not the actors who play them. So I would say from the very beginning of this kind of modern day version of fanfiction, we're seeing instances where the official creators of that canon and that story are interacting with the people who are creating fanfiction, and in a pretty symbiotic way, they're finding ways to commercialize it. Star Trek is putting out these novels that are within the canon of their story. Fan creators are putting out their own stories throughout zines, which involve a little bit more kissing than the books do, and sometimes we see authors from those zines cross over into the official publishing world for Star Trek itself. So from the very beginning of modern day fanfiction, fandom and commercialization of it actually have not been separate, but we have changed the way that relationship works with the dawn of the internet, and we have definitely slid down a very slippery slope to where we are now, where it is being used for clickbait marketing rather than kind of creation of more art.
Is Louis a hidden Omega? Does he hide it?
This is all new concepts to me. Like, I need some time to process.
So how did we get here exactly? There are three major instances that I want to highlight to illustrate kind of how we've gotten to this point of fanfiction being utilized for marketing in a massive way, and how things have changed from kind of being this sort of symbiotic relationship that we saw with Star Trek, which also I do want to point out, I'm really simplifying that relationship with the fandom and the actual canon-based group. I do think it's important to understand that the relationship between the Star Trek fan base and the actual canon and producers of the show is a complicated and nuanced situation, and that for the purposes of this video, so that we can kind of talk about how this Ferrari video came to be, I'm only using these moments as a way to illustrate how fandom has evolved and not getting into all of the nuances of each of these situations and relationships. That being said, outside of the kind of dawn of fanfiction and how it exists, there are three major modern day concepts that I want to talk about that have come from the building of the internet and how it has changed. Around 2000, we end up with a very weird situation with Anne Rice. Now, Anne Rice is the author and creative of a very massive franchise named Interview with a Vampire. Whether you've read the novels or you've seen the Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt movie from the 90s, or you're currently locked into the very chaotic version of the television show that's currently running as the Vampire Lestat, if you've heard of vampire media, you have probably heard of Anne Rice. Anne Rice's novel, Interview with a Vampire, which is actually right here, which if you do want to see a larger conversation about Interview with a Vampire and how impactful it was, one of the more recent episodes of You Are What You Love was a deep dive dive into Interview with a Vampire with my friend Amy. In that, we talk a lot about how Interview with a Vampire helped her understand her queer identity, and also how it gave her the opportunity to really start unpacking her Mormon upbringing and whether or not it was the right fit for her. Spoiler alert, it was not. Which, as I said, I am kind of moving through these moments, and I don't want to go too deep into the story of Interview with a Vampire, as I want to talk about Ferrari and Heated Rivalry and kind of that fan base marketing. But if you are looking for a deeper dive, you can of course get that on my channel now. Interview with a Vampire was incredibly successful and incredibly popular, and it also generated a number of fan works in this fanfiction space. At this point on the internet, we are seeing sites like fanfiction.net exist, which means that we are seeing kind of dedicated websites that are meant for fans to publish their fanfiction about characters in a space where they are not profiting from it, and in a dedicated space where readers and other fans can go and find that fanfiction. Anne Rice becomes aware of fanfiction and is distraught about the situation. And not only does she speak publicly against the concept of fanfiction and say that she doesn't like it, she also gets her lawyers to send cease and desist letters to the websites that are hosting fanfiction and the authors themselves. She gives a couple of reasons for this, but the major one is that she says that this is her protecting her copyright, and that derivative works are in violation of her copyright. The main problem is that the derivative works were not for profit. There is not any income being generated for these authors, and it's not being published for profit. A different argument, of course, would be utilizing copyrighted content and trying to physically publish those works, charging people online to read that fanfiction and therefore generating a profit from copyrighted material and characters, or even things like making unlicensed merch, which is a violation of copyright and can receive a cease and desist for. That being said, at this time, fanfiction really operates in this gray area, and people who were basically hobbyists just trying to connect with other people about this piece of content that they were very passionate about were now receiving intense cease and desist letters. The other legal concept that Anne Rice really breaches in this space is the idea that reading fanfiction could influence her own work, and then she could have a legal problem where a fanfiction author could say, I wrote this version of your story, and now you have kind of taken a plot point from my version of your story, published it, and now I am entitled in some capacity to that right of work. Anne Rice was essentially saying that, one, reading this fanfiction could influence her own writing, but two, that the concept of that fanfiction existing, this derivative work existing, opened her up to legal disputes with those fanfiction authors that were taking her characters, writing stories, and then would be able to say, I published this version of your story online at this time. Now you have a plot point that is very similar to that plot point that I created in your published work of your work, and now I can say that you've taken this from me. Now, I do want to point out that this actually is a legal concern that a number of people had for a long time. This isn't just in the space of fanfiction. You'll see authors and agents and publishers very frequently say that if you send unsolicited manuscripts or ideas, they will be destroyed without reading. This isn't because those people don't want you to be successful or they don't want to hear your ideas. It's because if they don't have this legal disclaimer, and if they did read it, if it's anywhere similar to something that they have in development or have thought of or may want to write one day, there would be a legal precedent for you to say, I sent you this idea of my original work and then you published a version of it. You stole it from me. And of course, when you have a digital kind of paper trail of that, it becomes a situation where you do have the ability to say, I created this on this date and you have stolen it from me. So with that legal disclaimer of saying, like, if you send anything, we're going to destroy it without reading it, it makes it very clear that you cannot make that argument. We said, do not send it to us unsolicited, and if you do, we definitely didn't read it. This is a really legitimate point in any sort of creative space like this, but it becomes a little bit stickier when we're talking about fanfiction. There was a really big wave of creators making it very clear that they never engaged in fanfiction, and that was important because they were trying to make sure no one could ever say, like, you took this story from me from this fanfiction that I created and put it on TV. But the thing about it is, and you'll genuinely never really see me defending Anne Rice, this is just, I think, an interesting point that she did make. Regardless of those disclaimers, people have always accused television shows of reading fanfiction and kind of taking that idea and putting it on screen. This does happen really frequently, and while there wouldn't be any real legal precedent because of how copyright works, it doesn't mean that people want to deal with that. So the one kind of argument that she has here is this idea that there would be a possibility of someone taking her characters who she created and owns and copyrights, and saying that this derivative work that they published online at a certain date has now shown up in published work, and they want to say that she stole their ideas. That is this kind of sticky situation, and one of the reasons why I think it's really important for fandom and the creators of that canon to stay separate. So Anne Rice has her lawyers send out these cease and desist letters, which causes a mass wave of panic. Writers do delete hundreds of thousands of words of Interview with a Vampire fanfiction from the internet. And popular websites even banned the posting of Interview with a Vampire fanfiction anywhere on their websites. And so you do end up with this thing where a ton of fan-created work is just completely wiped from the internet archives. That ultimately does lead to a website called Archive of Our Own being created. Archive of Our Own, or AO3 as it's popularly referred to, is kind of the gold standard when we talk about fanfiction these days. It's run by a nonprofit organization called the Organization of Transformative Works, or OTW. And I do want to read a little bit from their About Us section so that you can understand sort of how this came to be and what their goal is. The Organization for Transformative Works, OTW, is a nonprofit organization established by fans in 2007 to serve the interests of fans by providing access to and preserving the history of fan works and fan culture in its myriad of forms. We believe that fan works are transformative and that transformative works are legitimate. We are proactive and innovative in protecting and defending our work from commercial exploitation and legal challenge. We preserve our fanish economy, values, and creative expression by protecting and nurturing our fellow fans, our work, our commentary, our history, our identity, while providing the broadest possible access to fanish activity for all fans. And OTW has done a lot of really interesting work in the fan space when we talk about legal advocacy. One of the most interesting projects that they've actually done, in my opinion, was a project that started in 2008, which was obtaining an exemption of the DCMA for Blu-ray and DVD and video work to be utilized in non-commercial fan works. And they do a lot of work like this, which I could do a full breakdown if people are interested in sort of like the history of OTW and the legal advocacy they've done that makes the internet that we have today possible. But you can also do a lot of reading of this on Archive of Our Own if you go into the About Us section and then click the legal advocacy tab. So even though this version of Anne Rice sending out all of these cease and desist letters was pretty intense and kind of ridiculous, but I do see where she was coming from in one space, instances like this do lead to the creation of OTW and Archive of Our Own, and a real understanding of what fandom and fanfiction and transformative works are meant to be, which is a real separation from two things: commercialization for profit, and in my opinion, a space that stays completely separate from the celebrities and the creators of the original canon. Both of those lines start to get blurred in a very major way in 2011. Now, let's start with this idea of fanfiction for profit. In 2011, a novel that will change the course of the universe is published, and that novel is 50 Shades of Grey. Now, if you're not familiar with 50 Shades of Grey, it is an erotic thriller that ultimately became a multi-book series, but also became a massive movie franchise. It launches the careers of Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson into the stratosphere, and it becomes not only one of the best-selling novels in the history of romance books, but it also becomes one of the biggest talked about cultural points of the 2010s. It also has a major marketing point that hadn't really been done in the mainstream before, and that was that the origins of this story were very well known as Twilight fanfiction. 50 Shades of Grey was originally a Twilight fanfiction called Master of the Universe, which amassed a large following online. And that fanfiction went through a process that we call filing off the serial numbers. In this process, you take a story that was originally fanfiction, oftentimes a story that was published online as fanfiction, and you go through the process of changing all of the characters' names and features and as much as possible when it comes to the plot and anything that would have been relevant to the original work that you were writing a derivative work of, and you change that into an original work. From there, you've now taken enough of the story that was originally derivative of these copyrighted characters and changed them into your own work in theory that is separate enough that should not be a legal issue. Then you traditionally or self-publish this story for profit because it's no longer a derivative work, but instead an original work that was inspired by something else. Now, I am not going to get into the moral conversation of whether or not this is right or wrong. And I also want to say that 50 Shades of Grey was absolutely definitely not the first time that fanfiction went through this process and was traditionally published. But what it was the first time that fanfiction origins were being utilized as a marketing tactic. The fact that this was Twilight fanfiction and the fact that it was a very popular and risque Twilight fanfiction that was well known was actively utilized in not only the selling of this story to the publisher and ultimately then a movie deal, but also in the marketing of that book after it had gone through the process of filing off the serial numbers. It was never an origin story that they tried to bury or cover up, and in fact, it was a story that they tried to highlight as a method of getting the Twilight fanbase place to then buy into this story and purchase the book. And objectively, it became a very successful story and franchise. And because of the fact that the marketing was connected to Twilight, you could argue that they were utilizing someone else's copyrighted work to market and profit from their own work, which was not utilizing those copyrighted characters anymore, but was utilizing the idea of proximity to it. And that situation in particular gets even stickier because Stephenie Meyer, the author of Twilight, was open in the fact that it made her uncomfortable. Not only that, but she eventually did publish this novel, Midnight Sun, which was Twilight from Edward's perspective, but she actually originally canceled the publication of that novel, partially because some of the chapters had been leaked and she felt very upset about that, but also she had spoken about the fact that as soon as she had announced that she was planning to do that, the 50 Shades author, E.L. James, also announced that she was going to be doing a version of her first novel from the male protagonist's perspective. And there were a lot of similarities, not just in the origins of this story, which would have been the first book. There were a lot of other similarities that were considered in the production and the fan base that compared those things. Twilight, for example, was really famous for these original songs and these like really, really good soundtracks that have music that people are still slapping to today. 50 Shades of Grey became known for a similar thing, which was this massive amount of original songs and really good soundtracks that people really liked. The similarities were really big and it felt very intentional. And I would argue part of that intentionality is also why we're seeing so many people trying to replicate the process now. 50 Shades of Grey is well-known Twilight fanfiction that gets published and gets away with being published, is not in a legal dispute or any sort of copyright claims, and therefore establishes this kind of space in the publishing world of what exactly needs to be done for you to change well-known fanfiction into original published works without getting into legal trouble. It also sets this precedent of utilizing those fanfiction origins as a marketing tactic. And now, if you look at the publishing industry, we have seen massive waves of this repeating. First, of course, we had 50 Shades of Grey and Twilight fanfiction that was being published. Then I would say we also had a really big wave of Star Wars fanfiction being published. The Love Hypothesis, for example, is one that was well known as Star Wars fanfiction, and in the marketing of that book was not shied away from. It was well known that the author had written this as Star Wars fanfiction first, and then had gone through the process of making it an original work and publishing it. And a lot of the viral marketing for this was the fact that it was Star Wars fanfiction in the first place. That book, of course, has become a very popular novel and a huge bestseller. That author, Ali Hazelwood, has become incredibly successful, and The Love Hypothesis did get a movie adaptation by Prime that's coming out soon. And I will say that the casting of that movie felt like it was crossing a little bit of a line in that space, because the lead actor that was chosen for the male love interest is the husband of Daisy Ridley. Daisy Ridley famously played Rey in the Star Wars novels and was the other half of this fanfiction origin. And so her husband is now playing the male love interest in a movie that was based off of a book that was based off of fanfiction of a Star Wars movie that his wife starred in, and he's playing the male love interest from that relationship. Again, it gets into this space where it's intentional marketing of trying to reference the source material without saying that this is derivative and pulling from copyrighted material. Now the trend has inarguably become Harry Potter fanfiction, where we're seeing a number of Draco and Hermione fanfictions being reskinned as original works. Now, I do want to be clear, these authors are going through the process of changing that work to become original work. And I am definitely not saying that I think that fanfiction should not be reworked and published as original work. I think a lot of really incredible authors got their start that way. But I do think when we talk about the marketing of it, which is actually not on those authors entirely, it's on the publishers and the marketing agencies and the studios that are doing this, I think the gray area comes in when we start to utilize the fanfiction origins and the fan bases from those original works to sell your work for a higher value, to get yourself a 7-figure book deal, for example, and then a major movie deal from that, by focusing on the fact that it started as fanfiction of a very popular franchise, is where we get into a very big gray area when we talk about legality and morality. However, it's very clear that both the publishing industry and the film industry are okay with this, and this has become a tenement of successful works. Since 50 Shades of Grey was published in 2011, we have seen a massive wave of fanfiction origin stories being utilized in the marketing of books, which then get turned into massive movie franchises. And so over the last 15 years, we have seen this massive shift that has said this is okay, and creates this space where the commercialization of fanfiction and fan works is now becoming a standard instead of a taboo. Now, I said there were two things that happened in 2011, and the other thing that happened in 2011 is that a little show called Teen Wolf premiered. Now, Teen Wolf is a long lost love of mine. I do feel like I should disclose I did intern at MTV, and Teen Wolf was one of the shows that did make me want to go to film school. So I do talk about this from a place of bias, and I love this show so much. Teen Wolf premiering in 2011 seems like a pretty innocuous thing in this conversation, and I'm sure you're wondering, how exactly do we get to telling two Ferrari drivers about fan fiction and telling the stars of television shows about the Omegaverse, and why does it have anything to do with Teen Wolf? The Omegaverse thing feels like it actually might be self-explanatory, but Teen Wolf and the marketing of Teen Wolf actually have a number of things that I think blur this line between fandom and canon. Teen Wolf had a very active fan base online. You could not open Tumblr without seeing GIFs of a very popular ship, and that was Sterrick. Sterrick was the ship name for two characters, Styles Stilinski and Derek Hale. Now, if you are very confused about the idea of a ship name, again, I am trying to make sure that I am catering to some of you who just watch me for sports. A ship name is when you want two characters to be kissing on the mouth and you stick their names together in a new name. So you have Styles Stilinski and Derek Hale, shove them together the way you want them to kiss and you get Sterrick. You also could do things with like their last names, that happens sometimes. Very famously, one of the most popular ships on the internet right now is Hollanov, which is the combination of Hollander and Rosanov. Generally speaking though, at the beginning of a fandom or a ship starting, you will see a fan base kind of work through a couple different names and then ultimately settle on one that is collectively agreed upon. Now, Teen Wolf having this really active fan base and a really young fan base for a network like MTV made a lot of sense, and also became a space where MTV was taking these actually arguably really cool risks. One of the things I loved about MTV were the television shows that they were putting on air and how they were changing things really early on. MTV was one of the first channels to really focus on making programming for teenagers and filling a gap on television that existed, which was that after you kind of graduated out of Nickelodeon and Disney Channel and that type of programming, there wasn't an in-between place before you went into shows like HBO and Showtime and Cinemax. And in a similar way to the creation of young adult novels, we also saw MTV try to fill that space for the first time. They started that with reality television shows that were focused on teenagers as the subject, shows like My Super Sweet 16, Teen Mom, Room Raiders, and then shows that were kind of focused on new adults, like college-aged adults. So dating shows like Next or Date My Mom, and reality television shows like The Hills. And they eventually graduated out of doing that with just reality television and unscripted shows and game shows, and moving into doing scripted programming. Some of the best shows that we saw come out of MTV were very self-referential, like Zach Stone Is Gonna Be Famous, which was a show where Bo Burnham, someone who had become famous from using the internet, from using YouTube to put his work out there, plays a teenager who decides to use his college fund to start his own reality television show in order to make himself famous. And it was a really bold move from MTV at the time to actually make a television show almost making fun of the type of teenagers that they were putting on TV.
Hanging with Zach.
Dad, everybody out. Let's go.
This stuff is expensive, guy.
Outside.
Please. It's me, Susan.
Stop.
They had created this version of teenagerdom where people believed that they could become famous by being on reality shows like Teen Mom or on Date My Mom or these different shows. And there was this idea of wanting to be a reality star and really starting it in that space of time. Zach Stone Is Gonna Be Famous was this horrible real life version of this, where we knew that teenagers were watching reality TV and this concept of wanting to be a reality star rather than go do something else with your life was becoming a real thing. And so they actually make this television show that's scripted with a great comedian trying to reference this space that they actually took part in creating. So I think MTV, in a really cool way, was actually taking a lot of risks. We saw other shows come out of MTV later on, like Faking It and Sweet Vicious, which also really looked at kind of social issues that were happening to young adults. And I personally really loved a lot of the risks that were being done in programming, which also leads us to Teen Wolf and some of the decisions that they made that ultimately set a precedent for blurring the space between fandom and the network and creators of that show. Teen Wolf, again, has this very active fandom and this fan base that is very obsessed with one particular ship, Sterrick.
You say one word. Oh, what? You mean like, hey, Dad, Derek Hale's in my room. Bring your gun? Yeah, that's right. If I'm harboring your fugitive ass, it's my house, my rules, buddy. Oh my God.
The chemistry is there if you read between the lines, and it wasn't coming from nowhere. But what's interesting is that this is one of the first shows in a major way that we see really start to do fan service. Now, fan service is very different than fan fiction. Fan service is what we refer to as a creator of a show really referencing the actual fan base desires without actually making them canon. And we start to see this happen in Teen Wolf. There's a plot where a supernatural creature paralyzes Stiles and Derek from the neck down temporarily, and the way that they fall after they're paralyzed ends with one of them on top of the other, and they're forced to lay with each other for a large portion of that episode.
Get him off of me.
Oh, I don't know, Derek. I think you two make a pretty good pair.
And there's a plot where Stiles has to save Derek's life by keeping them above water in a pool while this character is kind of circling them. Those fan service moments with Stiles and Derek on screen continue throughout the show, but their relationship never becomes canon. We never actually see them have a romantic relationship on screen. And in fact, both of those characters continue to be in romantic relationships with women only. And even in the Teen Wolf movie years later after the show ends, we have this fan service moment of Derek maintaining Stiles' Jeep even after he's left town. There was a very clear understanding that the show was aware of how the fandom viewed these characters, and while they weren't going to change the actual plot and make these characters kiss on screen, they were going to give these moments that basically said, yeah, we see what you're posting online. Write some fan fiction about them being paralyzed on top of each other and jumping in a swimming pool, why won't ya? The other thing that Teen Wolf ends up doing in terms of a fan service moment is having the actors themselves film some content that becomes very romantic in tone. At San Diego Comic-Con, they have both of these actors sitting on a boat, and they film a video of them basically curled up with each other and kind of entangled limbs-wise, touching each other's faces, and Dylan O'Brien, who plays Stiles Stilinski, opens the video by saying, "We're on a ship."
Tyler.
Yeah.
Wake up.
No.
We're on a ship. Pun intended. Whoa.
Hey, man.
Hey, buddy.
And I remember being a part of this fan base when this started, and I thought it was fun. These were moments that were enjoyable, that seemed like they were kind of referencing their fan base, giving people what they wanted, and really having a good time. It's fun when actors are not only in on a joke, but also willing to have fun with it, but it does mean that now these actors are aware of how people are talking about their characters online. And it also sets this space where other actors can be asked to do the same thing, whether they're comfortable with it or not. But then Teen Wolf does something in a really massive way that does jump over that line. And that is deciding to run a fan fiction and fan art contest where there are real prizes for those submissions. They open this up and basically say that the fan fiction may not be explicit in nature, and you have to sign a legal release that obviously says that any of the ideas you put forward can possibly appear on screen because we may have already had that planned, and you release all legal liability for your ideas being shown on screen. Now, I do remember when this contest came out and the legal release came out, a lot of people were like, oh, they're out of ideas and they're trying to generate them from fans, and that's not what was going on. That legal release is kind of what we were talking about when we were looking at how Anne Rice was worried about being sued for her own work. It is just a protection that says if you want to enter this contest, you have to kind of release us from the liability of you putting something forward that later on does end up on screen because it was the natural progression of things, and most likely we had already planned to do it. We can't open ourselves up to every idea that Teen Wolf fanfiction writers might say and then not be able to put any of those storylines on screen. The same explicit caveat actually existed for the fan art contest as well. You couldn't submit explicit fan art, but the prizes were very different for both of these. For the fan art, you actually were going to have a chance to have your fan art aired on screen during a Teen Wolf episode commercial break. And this did happen. They did air fan art on MTV during an episode of Teen Wolf. And for the fan fiction contest, the prize was a little bit different. You actually got to have dinner with Jeff Davis, the creator of the show, and visit set. This was where things got a little weird for me. And I will say, actually, I don't know how many of you guys know this, before I started making YouTube videos and talking about sports online, I was a full-time writer, and I did create a show called That Vampire Show. This was a scripted fiction podcast, and one of the kind of inspirations for this story was this fan fiction contest and the idea of blurring the line between fandom, fan creators, and the actual creators of this work. In That Vampire Show, Kat Wright enters a fan fiction contest for her favorite television show, Bloodlines, which is a supernatural television show about vampire hunters. However, the creator of that show reads her fanfiction and absolutely hates it because she has focused on the fan favorite character who is a vampire being a good guy. So rather than just be a normal adult and move on with his life, he feels that he's being forced to deal with this fanfiction contest, and he chooses Cat Wright's Storrie as the winner intentionally, to then bring her to set and show her why the character that she believes is a villain with a heart of gold and redeeming qualities is well and truly evil. This was a story that very much was inspired by the idea of this crossover between fanbase and creator, and whether once we put work and art out into the world, we really have ownership of it still and get to decide how people feel about it. So if you're interested in listening to that and getting into a more fictional version of my feelings about that in fan fiction and fan spaces and the original creators of works, both as someone who was in a fan space and as someone who has been a creator myself, you can listen to that show either on the Tandem Productions YouTube channel or by searching That Vampire Show in any podcast platform. I'll also include links in the episode description down below. Anyways, this Teen Wolf fanfiction and fan art contest is a really interesting touch point, I think, in a space where we have gone from Anne Rice sending cease and desist letters to creators of fanfiction and fanfiction.net to a point where it causes mass panic and mass deletion of these works, to an official network of a television show calling for fanfiction and rewarding the artists by posting those on their television show and by bringing you to set to actually meet the creator of that show. Somewhere in that decade, we go from fanfiction being absolutely taboo to fanfiction being a way to get to the set of your favorite television show. And of course, with 50 Shades of Grey, fanfiction being a possible gateway to a massive career as a writer yourself. All of that space has created this world now where fanfiction is well known. Not only is fanfiction well known, but it's seen as a center of possible profit. And that is a big important part of how we get into a world where two actors show up to do press with BuzzFeed and are asked about the Omegaverse, or where, even worse, two Formula One drivers show up to film required sponsored content and are confronted with the fact that their fans are writing fanfiction about them as real people. And I think all of this fandom evolution also goes hand in hand with something we've been dealing with since the creation of Punk'd, which is embarrassing celebrities for our own entertainment and profit. Now, if you don't remember the television show Punk'd, it started in 2003, and that was a show that was hosted by Ashton Kutcher. In that show, every episode you watch celebrities be set up by their celebrity friends or non-celebrity friends for an elaborate prank that is being filmed the entire time. We are in on a joke that these celebrities are not in on, and we are watching them be publicly humiliated for our own entertainment. And not only was Punk'd a huge show in the 2000s, but we've seen multiple iterations of it continue to exist. Anthony Davis, the basketball player, has a celebrity prank show right now where he does pretty much the same thing. Another version of this that we see really for marketing and kind of viral clips is in 2012, which is when Jimmy Kimmel introduces a segment called Celebrities Read Mean Tweets. In this segment, we see a number of very famous celebrities who are there to promote a project, asked to read mean tweets that have been posted about them into the camera and react to them. Now, in general, we see most of this be kind of in good fun. The celebrities sort of react and they're like, oh, this kind of sucks. In some ways, you could argue that the segment itself was attempting to get people to understand the impact of posting those mean tweets. In theory, this segment should kind of make you think twice about what you post on the internet. If you feel comfortable enough to post something degrading towards a celebrity, a real life human being that you don't know, on the internet for your own entertainment, you should also recognize that that celebrity might one day see it, and maybe they will read it out loud on Jimmy Kimmel, a very popular late night television show. Are you comfortable enough with the hateful words that you're putting out there ending up in that type of a scenario? But something I thought was interesting was a piece that comes out in 2014 in Vanity Fair as this Celebrities Read Mean Tweets segment continues to air and be very popular by a writer named Mike Hogan. The article is titled How to Get the Biggest Stars in the World to Insult Themselves, and he takes ownership of one of the mean tweets that was posted and utilized in one of these videos. The insult he wrote was saying that Bob Newhart was old. Bob Newhart himself read that tweet out in this segment, and one of this writer's friends reaches out and is like, hey, did you write this mean thing about Bob Newhart? Because it was on Jimmy Kimmel last night. And what he talks about in this article is this idea of kind of a split feeling when he finds this out. First, he feels kind of like a douchebag. He's written this really mean thing that has now come out of this celebrity's voice. Something that may have been a throwaway thought or a joke to him has now been confronted with the subject of that joke, which was punching down. But the other part of him describes this feeling of pride, of being a good enough joke writer that his joke ends up on Jimmy Kimmel, and the delivery of it being so good that it's genuinely funny. And while he does go on to talk about some of the things that I talk about here, which is the idea that you should not be posting these types of things on the internet without thinking twice about them, and that this segment was designed not only to be very funny, but also to hold a mirror up to some of that abuse that these celebrities are experiencing online. I also think that that idea of a little bit of pride of hearing your tweet read out in a good voice from a comedian is one of the more dangerous parts of this segment. This segment also had the unintentional effect of having people post more mean things hoping that their insult would end up in this segment. There is a delight that people feel in confronting celebrities with something that makes them uncomfortable and feeling like you were the one who made that possible. And while I do think that if you post something on the internet like this, you should be aware that it's possible it will end up in the eyes of the person you're talking about. I think celebrities read mean tweets was a possible situation where we started to see this idea of confronting celebrities with internet culture and making that into a viral moment. We've seen plenty of versions of this. It's not just celebrities read mean tweets, but it's also these interviews where we see them kind of confronted with the most popular Google searches about them. That's an interview series where we see actors that are promoting a project kind of have to look at the most popular searches about them, usually getting progressively a little bit more embarrassing. And whether it was mean-spirited or not, you could look at all of these different types of interviews as one or the other. I do think we found this space where we said, okay, there is something viral in terms of confronting a celebrity who should be separate from the internet directly with what people are saying about them on the internet, which is kind of how we get into this space of fan fiction being brought into interviews. There are a lot of examples of fandom being utilized for kind of clickbait marketing. And while I am kind of curious how you guys feel about it when it comes into a fictional space, there are a couple of examples I want to go through to see what your opinion would be. First, we have this example with the Pitt. Recently, we've seen a number of Pitt actors confronted with fan art of themselves and their characters with each other. This was most popular with Noah Wyle and Garen Howell, two actors whose characters have become a popular ship in that fan space. Now, as someone who is a fan of the Pitt and does engage in the fandom, kind of like watching people talk about the show, I get fan edits on my For You page, etc. I will tell you, I had no idea that these two characters were being shipped until I saw a video of Noah Wyle being shown fan art, explicit fan art of him and his co-star. The gray area here is that it is characters, not the actors that are being shipped, and that the art that was being shown was about the characters, again, not the actors. However, I do think there are two possible issues here. One, especially when we're talking about a romantic relationship that is not canon in the show, it is a little odd to confront two actors with that because there is two different spaces. One, those actors may be uncomfortable with that conversation and it may be something that is very awkward for them to deal with, especially given the fact that there's no right answer. If they say, yes, we think this is fun, then you're implying to the fans that you would like to see that on screen, and there is a possibility that your employer is upset about that, or that the fans are then upset when that doesn't actually come to fruition. Or two, if they respond and say like, no, that this would never happen, I don't really know where it's coming from, you're putting them in a position where there is a massive fan backlash. And three, I think anything kind of explicit in nature that deals with your likeness is not something you should be confronted with at work, whether it is a character that you're playing or your own person. It is still your face, your body, your likeness that are being utilized in this way. And while I think fan spaces should be able to exist in every way, and I also, of course, obviously have engaged in kind of consuming this content myself, I don't think it's appropriate for a journalist of any kind to confront those actors with it, with them being unknowing and not necessarily consenting. But I am curious how you guys feel specifically about the Pitt instance, because those moments did go very viral. And we did see the comments of those videos sometimes very positive, people thinking that this was very funny, or a lot of comments of like the subject is becoming self-aware, oh no. Then we get into the BuzzFeed of it all. Hudson Williams and Connor Storrie were very unknown before the start of Heated Rivalry. And their press tour at the beginning of Heated Rivalry was something that was put together very quickly because there was not an expectation that this show was going to have the demand that it did. It was a very small Canadian production and it didn't have international distribution when they were first talking about promoting the show. So when it did get distribution at HBO Max to be released simultaneously in the States, we also saw a very quick press tour put together for the States to actually be involved in. This resulted in like this insane whirlwind tour where we were seeing them do a large number of on-camera interviews together. And in those on-camera interviews, we often saw them having a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was like it was a hungry little like scrappy coyote that just wanted to hump, and he was in heat and he just wanted to, you know, whimper away.
But humping in heat is you with tears in your eyes
I wanted Jane to be a little coyote, you know, a little horny little mutt.
The show itself is explicit in nature, of course, and that means that there were a lot of conversations about that type of material. However, there were also these moments where the interviewers were confronting them with thirst tweets about themselves, the concept of fanfiction, and BuzzFeed's new favorite question, the Omegaverse. Hudson and Connor were told about the Omegaverse, were asked about like the dynamics of this, how they felt about it, and they do a good job of playing it off, but I personally think this is so uncomfortable. And I'm not going to get into the depths of the Omegaverse in this video. Google is free and someone else has definitely made a video about it for you, but I will tell you that widely the accepted origination of the Omegaverse was a 2010 supernatural fanfic, and that fanfiction was actually RPF. Now, RPF, for the uninitiated, stands for real people fiction. It is the practice of writing fanfiction about real people, not characters. And in this video, I don't want to get into a conversation about the legitimacy or the morality of writing RPF. I do want to just say that it is something that exists, and it's something that existed for a long time. But the creation of RPF is something I do very strongly feel should never be confronted with that celebrity, because there is no gray area about how uncomfortable that would be for a real person. If you found out that people were writing stories about you and your coworker being romantically involved, and you were asked to react to that on camera at your place of business, that would be something that would be considered harassment. Just because these people are publicly facing figures does not mean that that harassment goes away, which is how we get into this conversation about the Ferrari drivers and this Peroni video. Now, mind you, Hudson and Connor were confronted with kind of this idea of thirst tweets and people talking about them, but to my knowledge, I haven't seen an interview where they were confronted with RPF. However, we do know that Hudson Williams was aware of this idea of people shipping him with Connor and was uncomfortable with it. He did respond to that on Threads, and it became a massive issue. But when we talk about Peroni and this video with their Ferrari drivers, this was something that was completely planned out, a job requirement, and not something that they just happened upon on the internet. Whether they had decided to find that or whether they had decided to comment on it, regardless, that is not something that they sought out. It's something that while they were at their job were required to find out about. Now, if you're not familiar with kind of how sponsor obligations work in the world of sports, in a ton of sports, but especially with Formula One, you have sponsors of your team. Those companies pay a lot of money to have their logo on the side of a Formula One car, or on your jersey, or on your helmet, etc. And with that cost and spend, they also receive a certain amount of obligations from those drivers and that brand to market their own brand. Now with Peroni, they decided to utilize some of that obligation to make this video. In this video, it is literally shown as Peroni presents fan stories, and they have Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, who are teammates. Also, mind you, Lewis Hamilton is 40 years old in a public relationship with Kim Kardashian. Charles Leclerc is 28 years old and recently married, and arguably both of them are probably not on this side of the internet. Now, if you have ever engaged in Formula One fandom, and also maybe if you haven't and your algorithm just gets you involved in it, you know that there are fan-made videos that are shipping these drivers together, that talk about the relationship between these drivers, and that theorize and desire for romantic relationships between these drivers. Now, all of this is a completely common form of fandom. However, the idea of confronting them with it directly is very different to me. In this video, which was posted to social media, we saw these drivers asked to read the titles of fanfiction that were written about each other to each other, and then that driver had to guess what the plot of the story was. Now, one of the things that was very hard to verify when I was trying to go through the research to make this video was the actual content of these stories. Based on comments and conversation, we've seen a number of people say that they were the ones who wrote these stories, or that they know people who wrote these stories, and that those fanfiction writers were not contacted for consent for them to be used in this video. There's also a number of people who have said that these stories were explicit. However, I personally was not able to verify that because a number of these stories were instantly deleted off of the internet because these authors were mortified. Now, we don't see anything in the final edit that shows that these stories were explicit either, and we luckily don't see them reading like excerpts from the story itself. What we do see is these drivers reacting in real time to these stories that have been written about them. There's one where Lewis Hamilton guesses that he is written into like an MI6 story.
So like 007 but 004 for MI6, and I'm spying for the UK.
There's another one where Charles Leclerc uses the word alternate universe before talking about something called the family grid, where all of the drivers live in a house together.
An alternate universe where the entire F1 grid lives together as one giant family.
Oh god.
And you see in that one in particular that they are kind of like, what? This is such a weird thing to do. And what I really wanted to do with this video is not just sit down on and say, I think it's weird that Peroni made two grown men show up at their place of business and read fanfiction about themselves to each other for their job. That's weird, and that's that. I wanted to kind of unpack the world that we have created that makes a brand think that this is a good idea, because the video did do very well. I've sat down and recorded a deep dive video to explain this to you as to why we got here and why it's so weird. So it's not that they were wrong that it would be good for kind of clicks, virality, and marketing, but I do think they had a fundamental misunderstanding of whether or not this would be well received. To me, I do think that being told at your place of business on camera at a sponsor obligation that your fans are kind of writing stories about you being romantically involved with your coworkers is a form of harassment. And also, once that box is unlocked and you're kind of putting that online, you're telling people that it is okay for those drivers to then be confronted with it. This video ends with Lewis Hamilton being like, I didn't know what fanfiction was, but now I kind of want to read stories and write some myself. And through no fault of his own, he doesn't realize that this is implying to fans that it's totally okay to bring fanfiction up to him, to other drivers to continue writing it, or to confront them directly with it. The same thing can be said for things like having Hudson and Connor and the stars of Interview with a Vampire read thirst tweets about themselves, or to be confronted with the Omegaverse. Now you get into a situation where fans are being told by major corporations with the faces of those celebrities themselves that if I meet one of these people in real life, it's completely okay for me to be like, hey, did you know that you're an Omega? Did you know that your co-star is a total alpha? Do you know about Lestat? This is an even worse version than that idea that we talked about with celebrities read mean tweets. What was supposed to be a funny segment and also hopefully tell you that saying mean things on the internet is not happening in a vacuum also created a desire for people to write meaner things on the internet with the hope of getting their joke on Jimmy Kimmel. 50 Shades of Grey being published and being well known as Twilight fanfiction and marketed as Twilight fanfiction also created a pipeline of people thinking that they could commercialize their fanfiction and writing it for that explicit reason. It created a real life version of saying if you write fanfiction for a very popular franchise, make that fanfiction very popular online, and then attempt to change that story and commercialize it, you could be a very wealthy person. And it takes away the idea of fanfiction for not profit, fanfiction for the sake of engaging with your story and other fans, and instead a desire to create your own massive career. And then of course, for these viral moments, you have actors being confronted with the idea of their characters kissing. And then we're taking it one step even further with athletes who do not play other characters that exist as themselves entirely all the time at their job, being confronted with the idea of people wanting them to be romantically involved with their coworkers and direct competition. And you're doing that on camera with a brand attached to it and putting it online, telling people that it is okay to confront these people with it, whether it is online or in person. And I think that is the very dangerous precedent that we are setting with these types of videos. While it's great to have a viral moment that is a marketing clickbait situation, and while it's wonderful that these drivers were able to kind of have fun with it and find a way to be comfortable, while it's great that we got these really funny moments from celebrities reading mean tweets, or the cast of Heated Rivalry and Interview with a Vampire finding out about the Omegaverse or reading thirst tweets about each other, it also continues to sort of blur the line between what is an acceptable way of interacting with a celebrity and what isn't. There also are a lot of legal implications from profiting and commercializing fan works, because as we talked about, one of the biggest important things when it comes to copyright is making sure that these works are not being commercialized. However, in these videos, they are monetizing the idea of fan works by utilizing them to have celebrities, actors, athletes reacting to that content. Fanfiction in this sense is actually being monetized. It's just not being monetized by the writer themselves. And it does put us in this really weird situation where the question is, if they're monetizing based off of work that was created by someone else, are they crossing a legal line? Regardless of a legal line, because I am not a lawyer, so I don't know the answer to that, I do think they're crossing a moral one. And I also think crossing that line additionally begins to make people think that it's okay to cross a line with that celebrity directly. And it's opening us up to a larger world of harassment by fans of celebrities, whether those are actors or athletes. And it's something that I desperately hope stops soon. So as I said at the very beginning of this video, please, I am begging you, stop telling celebrities about the Omegaverse. And objectively, don't tell them about fanfiction either, and definitely don't do it on camera. However, I would love to know your feelings about this. I'm personally kind of worried we're going to start to see a lot more athletes asked about fanfiction, shown fan art, and asked about the Omegaverse Omegaverse and other things that are fandom specific. And I wonder if you have seen any other instances of this type of marketing that has been either with celebrities or athletes or actors, and how you feel about that, and whether you feel like there's a different line for athletes than there is for actors who are engaging in kind of fan content of their show and their characters versus how athletes are being asked to engage in fan content about themselves as people. I would love to know your feelings on any of these examples, if you feel like any of them are different than the other, if you thought there was any kind of moment in your fandom history that helped lead to this world that we're living in now, and if you have any feelings about that timeline that I shared, and if you learned anything new. As always, I break down sports in a way that makes them accessible to everyone and talk about entertainment, sports, and culture and where they intersect. So if you would like to engage in more of that type of content, be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss the next video, and let me know if there are any other hot topics like this that you are hoping that I will cover. Of course, I'm also going to include in the episode description a link to that vampire show if you're interested in it, and you can always find me on social media on all platforms at Marissa Kumari. Thank you for watching this one, and I will see you next time.